Hello and welcome. I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, and I'm answering some questions that have come into me on YouTube and Instagram. And I'd like to thank all of you who've taken the trouble both to watch and indeed to send in questions. If you want to be involved in future, if you subscribe and switch on notifications, when I do this again, then you'll get a notification straight away. And I will do my best to answer as many questions as possible without boring you all by going on forever. But thank you for the questions, which are really good and interesting. And I'll go through them in categories rather than just one by one, because they've come in various areas. And I thought I'd start with the economy, because the British economy is in terrible trouble. We are facing a difficulty in the bond market, and that will lead through to a problem for the pound. And we're also seeing difficulties in the tax revenues and expenditure. It's a classic Labour squeeze, and no wonder there are so many questions on it. So Nibbler2281, what a great name, has said, how do we drag ourselves out of a possible debt spiral that it appears even the US has been sucked into? And I think the question here is, how do you get economic growth? And this is something governments have wrestled with. How do you achieve growth with a limited budget? And the answer has to be supply-side reforms. Our economy is massively overregulated. There are so many things that you are simply not allowed to do. It's harder than it was to set up a business, harder than it was to open a bank account. We need significant deregulation because it's cost-free. If we can grow the economy, if we can increase the size of the overall national income, then you can begin to cut taxes. But I think we also need to cut expenditure, particularly wasteful expenditure, because we're spending money badly and it's being spent by the state, run by individuals and businesses. Emilio 14K, maybe I think it's 14K, said, would IMF intervention lead to a devaluation of the pound? I don't think there will be IMF intervention in this country, because unlike in 1976, all our debt, or almost all our debt, is sterling denominated. And that is a more closed system. In 1976, we still had some US dollar debt, hence the need for IMF intervention. And why Eurozone countries have needed IMF intervention, because by being a member of the Euro, they have given up control of their currency. So I think there's a higher risk of France having an IMF involvement than the UK, but I would certainly be worried about the level of the pound against the dollar if this debt problem continues. And following on from that, Stuart Garvin, 8821, says, how would you hedge against the potential downturn in the UK economy? In terms of what sort of investments would you be looking at, I would always look at a spread of investments. I would look at ensuring that you're not entirely exposed to sterling, that you have asset exposure to the dollar, possibly to the yen, that you want to be thinking about investing in companies that have multi-currency investment streams, so invest in multinationals in the UK sphere. Also bear in mind that if the pound falls sharply, interest rates would probably rise, but inflation might rise as well. So the value of the pound in your pocket would shrink under those circumstances, as it has been in recent years, not least because of some pretty catastrophic action by the Bank of England. This leads on very nicely to Stephen Lowther, 1562's question, safest and most effective place to keep your money and earn income from. I am going to develop this later in other broadcasts, but I would be looking at value stocks at the moment, stocks that have steady income streams, provide routine products that people have to buy even when economics are difficult, and give a dividend yield. Those are the ones that are probably best placed if we have a significant economic downturn. As I say, I'll come back to that subject in more detail. And Mike Leake, 2662, asks, do you agree that the fiat monetary experiment has failed? What do you see the next evolution of money to be? I was surprised when you said that you don't understand Bitcoin enough to know whether it could be a replacement in terms of store of value. Do you not think that researching and understanding Bitcoin is a good use of your time? Thank you. Yes, absolutely. And I have a working understanding of Bitcoin, But it's much easier to understand where gold comes from. Gold comes out of the ground, people mine it, they refine the ore that has come out to get the gold. The growth in supply is limited. It has been a store of value for hundreds, if not thousands, of years. And the fiat currency experiment always fails. Right back to when the Chinese first do it in, I think, about the 11th century. Fiat currencies always lose their value. Why? Because it's really easy for governments to produce more of them. You just print it. And the more you print, the less value it has. Whereas with gold, only a certain amount is found each year. And so the money supply is controlled, and therefore the value of money is maintained. Bear in mind, the dollar has lost 92% of its value in the period of central bank independence. The creation of Bitcoin is done in a technological way. It's used blockchain technology, but it's got a certain mystery about it, and it's the mystery of it that I am cautious about and makes me slightly nervous of advocating investment in something. When you say worth understanding, you're absolutely right, but one should always be aware that one may not fully understand because there may not be full information available. And my experience of investment is that the best way to make money is, in the first place, not to lose it. And with something that has gone up as much as Bitcoin has, and with the opacity about how Bitcoin comes about and who started it and so on, there needs to be a certain level of caution. It's not only questions on the economy I've had. I've also had quite a wide range of what I'd call governmental, constitutional questions. So AB/KQ9XM, that's a wonderful code name. You'll probably aspire, I should think, the name like that. Says, how likely do you think an early general election is for the current government? I think very unlikely, with a majority of 170. Why? Why would you risk going out of government? It is much more likely that they remove Keir Starmer and put somebody else in. And before that happens, I wouldn't be surprised if Keir Starmer got rid of Rachel Reeves. Malcolm824 says, how should the monarchy retain public support whilst appearing to back such unpopular governments? The monarchy must rise above all politics, and everyone needs to know that the king neither supports nor opposes his government. He is a facilitator of the popular will. He is there to act as a unifying symbol of the nation. He is not there to express political views. And actually, the king's been brilliant in the last 3 years, even though we know he's got strong views in certain areas, some of which I may disagree with. He's been very good at not highlighting those, and I think that's tremendously important. J5X7, who may be one of Elon Musk's children, says, how possible is it to fully dissolve and rebuild whole departments that are unfit for purpose, like the Home Office? It's very difficult to do overnight, and you need good ministers. All departments need ministers with drive who make the ultimate decisions and make it clear that they want to make the decisions. Then you get better civil servants. You also need to reform how the civil service operates. And I think, frankly, we're going to need to politicize the civil service. We're going to be need to be more American, so the people who are implementing ministerial decisions actually want to do it rather than trying to avoid doing it. A similar question, really, from JCFGH says, could a new government make 20% of all civil servants redundant, and would it make any negative difference to the running of our country? And then signed, James. You could easily get rid of 20% of civil servants. When I was Minister for Government Efficiency, we developed a plan to do exactly that. And we were working through with the departments how they could do it. We've seen the civil service bloat, and they use the excuse of Brexit, and they use the excuse of COVID, get more and more people, make them all go and work in the office, let those who don't want to leave the civil service, make sure that they're doing a full day's work, but stop doing things that are pointless. A lot of what the government does doesn't actually need to be done. An odd word in defence in this context of David Lammy, not somebody I normally come to the defence of, but why on earth did he need a licence from the Environment Agency to fish in his own pond? If you got rid of the requirement for a licence, you could get rid of the civil servants who administer it. So stop doing things you don't need to do, remove the civil servants who are doing it, reduce the number, save the cash, give people tax cuts. Arthur Bullhouse, 6176, says, how do you see conservatism developing in the coming decade towards a more populist vein or return to traditionalism? Well, I wouldn't see the two of those in conflict. I think traditionalism is very popular. It's a very interesting picture in one of the newspapers today showing a traditional crescent building against a modernist crescent building. 81% preferred the traditional one with pillars and symmetry and elegance against the modernist and brutalist one. So I think you should trust people to have small c conservative views, and therefore you can bring them together. But the radicalism we need is to restore beauty, restore effectiveness, restore democracy, because far too much of what happens in this country is ruled by an unelected blob, a bureaucracy, a quangocracy, a judiciary that has become overpowerful. And I want power to go back to elected ministers. If you don't like what they do, you can remove, you can fire them. Stone Cold ET944 says, do you believe that the faith and belief in what we call government has been eroded to a point that now the sets of occupations that define government are in essence totally symbolic only? The faith and belief in government is at a very, very low level. The trust in Keir Starmer is extraordinarily low and has collapsed in the last year, and a lot of that's his fault for doing things that appear to be hypocritical. It's also the failure to answer the problems the country really minds about. I cannot tell you how struck I was today to read the headline, front page of the Times, it's in the other papers too, saying that government ministers have argued to the court, and I'm sorry to say successfully, that the rights of migrants are more important than the rights of local people. This is outrageous. Our rights should come first. And if ministers are saying that, then confidence, in Henry Blofeld's terms, calypso, collapso, and it's hard to see it getting better. Praveen Jerry says, do you think parliamentary democracy has failed in Britain? To which my answer is no. It's just we haven't been using it recently. I think parliamentary democracy is extremely successful. In Donald Trump terms, it's beautiful. It really works. It's responsive. Local MPs are in their communities, but Parliament has lost power to other bodies. It's been taken away from them. It's gone to initially Europe, then to quangos and so on. Parliament needs to take back control on behalf of the people. It's not for the virtue of MPs, it's for their representative nature of the people who send them to Parliament that they need to have power. Really interesting question from Henry Barr, 7307. Do you consider yourself more Burkean or libertarian in your conservatism? A combination of the two, and I think Burke would probably have a libertarian streak within him if you asked him this question, because he believed in the ancient liberties that we enjoyed and that were protected by our constitution. But he also accepted that people had responsibilities within communities one to another, and that they needed to provide for each other and protect each other, and that if you'd been doing something for a very long time, there was probably a good reason for it, and that you should evolve rather than have revolutions. And I think that fits in with libertarianism. I want people to be as free to do whatever they want to do as far as possible. I believe in the basic common law principle that anything that is not specifically illegal is legal. And Burke would have agreed in that too. My worry is that in the last 200 years, we've made too many things regulated, to go back to my earlier point on regulation. And Ian, 8008, says, in view of your recent common sense videos, how do you account for the socialist disaster of the Conservative Party since Margaret Thatcher, where the country consistently moves in one direction and they never undid the Blair-Brown policies that mattered, but just continued them? This is fundamental. I'll tell you what happened, in my view. The Conservatives remained conservative in the 97 election, the 01 election, the 05 election. But having lost all three, the hierarchy of the Conservative Party, and this is David Cameron and George Osborne primarily, came to the conclusion that Conservatives weren't going to be re-elected, and that if we wanted to have a centre-right government, it needed to accept the Blair, essentially Blair, but also Brown settlement. This was disaster, and the timing was atrocious because they did it just before the financial crisis. They failed to point out the economic incontinence of socialism just before it collapsed. So when we got to 2010, we had no narrative as to why the Blair-Brown years hadn't worked, and therefore no mandate for reversing what they had done. David Cameron also uses his power as leader of the party to change the candidates list. People like me, people who are genuinely conservative, found it very difficult to become candidates. Indeed, my agent was told the night before my selection that North East Somerset could select anybody as long as he wasn't called Rees-Mogg. There was great hostility to real conservatism, and that fed through, so that you have Cameron until 2016, then you have Theresa May, who was very sympathetic to some of the trans arguments of fundamentally unconservative views. She never wanted to leave the European Union and didn't particularly have a plan for what to do once the country had voted to leave. She seemed to have an awful lot of non-conservative views. When she went, Boris came in, but you still had about a third of the parliamentary party that was deeply committed to this sort of Lib Dem view of the world. And that made it impossible to do the extra things that needed to be done to pull out of the European Convention on Human Rights. There simply wasn't a majority in Parliament for it. And this all goes back to the loss of confidence in 2005. What I think is happening now is that we're realizing that conservative answers work, and that applies to Nigel Farage in Reform and Kemi Badenoch in the Conservative Party. It certainly applies to me, and we are now able to make those arguments, and people are listening to them, and people like you are kindly saying that they are common sense views, and I would certainly agree with that. All those questions so far from YouTube, but we've got some from Instagram as well, in a similar vein. Jason, brilliant number, 1212 121267. 1212 used to be the telephone number of Scotland Yard. If you watch old black and white films, you will see they pick up the telephone, they say Whitehall 1212, and they get straight through to Scotland Yard. So I don't know, Jason, if you're thinking about that. How do we get Labour out before the 4 years and the UK becomes a third world country? I fear our constitution works in such a way that that is not actually going to happen. They are there. We must use the 4 years well, as Margaret Thatcher did 1975 to 1979, so we know what to do when we get a right-wing government, and we then do it and implement it and change the country for the better and get rid of the socialist nostrums of Blair and Brown and Starmer. That's the real challenge. Don't waste the 4 years. Don't just think you can't do anything until 2029. Get ready. Be a good Boy Scout. Be prepared. TW31973, are you a supporter of the reform plans to withdraw from the human rights treaties? Absolutely. Strongly against them. I think they do not go with the grain of the British Constitution. So I think we should withdraw from them as a matter of urgency. The best protector of human rights is our parliamentary democracy. NipVY65 says, do you believe Islam is compatible with liberal Western values? I think Islam is a challenge to Western values. It believes in many different things, and it doesn't have a specific differentiation between church and state. So in terms of how this country is run, I don't think that's a particular problem, because we're not going to have an Islamic government. But you see in Iran that there is no differentiation between church and state, and that is problematic. And Sharia law within this country is problematic. It counts as arbitration rather than separate courts. But I wonder whether that's the right approach, and whether all the people who receive judgments from Sharia courts feel that it is, in fact, arbitration rather than actually a judgment that they have to follow. So I think there are definite problems with it. What is my view on Rupert Slow's new party? Rupert is a charming man. I can't say I know him well, but I've met him a few times. I'm afraid I think his new party is an irrelevance, even if it's getting money from Elon Musk. That we've already got too many parties. We need to reunite the right. Having another party doesn't help anybody, and frankly, nobody's taking any notice of it, and I doubt they will. Interesting question from Dylan_Kiefer27. How did you strike a balance between constituency and cabinet politics? always I knew that I could only be a cabinet minister because I represented North East Somerset. I was a member of Parliament. So my constituency work remained not only important to me, but really very rewarding. I enjoyed doing it. I valued the time and trust constituents placed in me. And that work took place, constituency surgeries, correspondence, carried on whilst I was a minister. But I knew as a minister, I had to have the interests of the nation at large rather than specifically of North East Somerset. I was lucky. I didn't have an issue like HS2 or one of those things where your constituency interest and the national interest is conflicted. So it was relatively straightforward for me. But I do appreciate sometimes ministers have that national-local conflict, and then they just have to get a balance or ultimately resign in the interests of their constituents, which is an honourable thing to do. Joseph J. Plant says, do you think the king should be given more or less power in politics? I don't think the king wants power in politics. I was actually talking to Mary in preparation of her beginning A-level politics about George V selecting Baldwin over Curzon when Bonelaw had to resign. And Mary said to me, can the king still do that? And I explained that no, the king, or actually the late Queen, gave up that power when Alec Douglas-Home became Prime Minister and allowed the parties to choose. And in a democracy, that was right. The less power a constitutional monarch has, the better, that the constitutional monarch is a safeguard in the most roundabout way, which people don't really understand. So perhaps I should try and explain. If the king is advised by the Prime Minister, advised with a capital A, to do something, the king has to follow that advice. But the Constitution works so that advice will not be given that is not within the ambit of the Constitution and to which the king would want to say no. So there is a safeguard to protect the king from embarrassment and to protect the system from unconstitutional activities. This was something the remarkably stupid Supreme Court did not understand in relation to the prorogation of Parliament. The Queen would not have been asked a question to which she would have wanted to say no. That was very important. And actually, when it was rumoured that Boris Johnson, when he was about to cease being Prime Minister, might instead ask for a dissolution, the various private secretaries made sure that question couldn't be put, to remain within the agreed bounds of constitutional propriety. Rob P. Green says, does the civil service make decisions or the government? Well, the civil service say, oh, Minister, you can't do that because of the Climate Change Act or because of the Human Rights Act or because of whatever it is. They don't say to you directly, Minister, you can't do that. They say why. And that's where ministers can make decisions, because they can always present a bill to Parliament to change the law. But ministers stopped doing that, partly because whilst we were in the EU law overrode an act of Parliament. That no longer happens, but that power hasn't yet been used properly. Now, there are quite a lot of personal questions which I thought I would work through. So Nicholas Perry, 7042, says that he wishes I would return to politics because despite being guilty of misplaced loyalty to the Conservative Party, he thinks I have a great deal to offer the British people. What reservations do you have regarding Nigel Farage and the reform movement? Well, first of all, thank you. Thank you for your complimentary question. I admire Nigel Farage. I think he is a very able man, formidably capable politician, and agree with a lot of what he says. My view is the right needs to reunite in advance of a general election so that we can have a majority and a mandate to implement the reforms that are necessary. So that's the point. We've got to work together. And so it's not about me as an individual. It's about how do we reverse this terrible mess created not just by Labour, but by the constraints that the Tories accepted on themselves whilst we were in government, and by the number of Tory MPs who weren't really very conservative whilst Boris was Prime Minister, that undermined the majority of 80, and of course got rid of Liz Truss so quickly. So it's about getting the right to work together. Taylor-1997 asks, will there be a PM Rees-Mogg one day? Well, I wonder whether that's a question for one of my children. Both Peter and Mary are very interested in politics, so it might be interesting not for me to be a prime minister, to be a father of a prime minister, which is a very exciting prospect, and I'll certainly encourage them if they have political ambitions. And then W0RM Blood 323. What's your favourite meal? Probably Sunday lunch of roast beef and Yorkshire pudding, with some decent pudding to follow. I also have a soft spot for chocolate souffles, and I quite like Tornadoes Rossini, which is a bit of steak with a slab of foie gras on top, which I would strongly recommend. Lots of people have asked, am I aiming to re-enter politics, or when am I going to join Reform? I would love to re-enter politics. I think there's a great deal to be done, and I would like to be part of that. I mean, I'm more than happy to contribute from the sidelines, but I just want to make sure that we get the reforms that we need. It really is, we've got to make this country great again. Just what Trump has done, it is possible, we need to do it. I'm not planning to join Reform. We need to reunite the right. That's my fundamental objective, to get that majority and a mandate. Who is my tailor? Well, this suit is made by Henry Poole, who have made quite a lot of my suits over the years. Really good firm. They also make the state uniforms for the outriders on the King's coaches for the great events of state. And what next? Would I consider beekeeping? Yes, strongly. I'm very tempted by beekeeping. I did a bit of it went to see some beekeepers in my reality TV program. Haven't got around to it yet. Currently, I'm focusing on quails, and we've had quite a few quails pop out of their eggs, actually, over the last couple of days. We've got lots of little quails at the moment, and we're trying to get them to grow and feed them and so on. Thomas Bear, 20, asks, what was it like to be in government? It was extremely interesting and very rewarding. You make decisions, and even in spite of the civil service sometimes not allowing you to, you're there, you're on the line, you make decisions and you defend them, and you hope you're improving the country for the better. So it was a fascinating experience. You work stunningly hard. I've never worked harder in my life, but I absolutely loved that hard work that went with being in government. This question from Andres Crone. Advice for young people getting involved in politics, should we? Yes, politics is very rewarding. You help people, you do things for people, you change people's lives for the better. And what would my advice be? Persevere. If you want to do it, do it. Don't let people tell you that you can't. Perseverance is everything. Downton Collection asks, what are the best history books? That's a hard question. I love reading history books. I'm currently reading Jonathan Sumption's 4-volume History of the 100 Years' War, which, if you've got some time on your hands, I would strongly recommend. I actually told Jonathan when I bumped into him that I much prefer the bits when England is winning than when we're losing. I'm afraid I'm currently in a bit where England is losing, which is all a bit gloomy. I've got Agincourt to come, which will be cheering, but then it's pretty much downhill all the way from there. Christian Wood wants me to talk about my interview with Ali G. Well, I was one of his early victims, subjects, what term do you like to use? I had no idea who he was. He hadn't been on television at that point. Channel 4 sent me a letter saying there was a new interviewer called Ali Gupta. He had a surname at that point and he wanted to come and interview me. He came round, and I'm afraid I thought, poor man, he's got this new chance of interviewing, and he doesn't seem to be making any sense at all. I didn't understand half of what he was saying to me, and I just tried to humour him for the time the interview took and hoped to get away with it. When it was broadcast, I realised that I'd been had, but I thought his first series were extremely funny. Exclude me, but some of the interviews he did were really just brilliantly clever and amusing. And the one with Tony Benn always stands out, and the one with Charlie Hindlip, where I think he asked him if Tony Hart was one of the best artists in history. It really was very cleverly done. So Jack P. 1908 says, what are the 3 British car brands for a gentleman to drive? Well, I think that Aston Martins are the most beautiful cars. I don't have one, I can't afford one, but my goodness, aren't they wonderful? Particularly the James Bond ones, the DB5, which Bond drives, but the DB6 is similarly elegant. On my own account, I have a 1936 Derby Bentley, the 3.5 litre Derby Bentley, which is a beautiful car and fun to drive around in. You can hear me coming as I fail to double declutch properly between first and second gear, and you hear this terrible crunching of the gears. But other than that, it's a great car. And for every day, I have a really nice Jaguar, and I'm glad Jaguar's got rid of its new advertising and is actually going back to what customers want. So those are the personal questions. There are a few questions on immigration, which I've obviously been talking about recently. If you've entered our country, and this is from Mark Palmer, 8083, if you've entered our country unlawfully, why is it not the law that you can never claim asylum and automatically and immediately be arrested and deported to your home country or, in exceptional cases, to an alternative country? Mark, I just completely agree with you. And this was where the law was going under the last Conservative government. We said that if you arrived illegally, you could not claim asylum. You were an illegal entrant. You had to claim asylum before and not come over in a small boat. We've simply got to clamp down on this and say that anyone who comes here illegally can never get British citizenship. You've got to stop the incentives for coming. I was reporting, as you probably saw, on a hotel near where I live, near where I am today, which is a really nice country house hotel set in 7.5 acres of land. Oh my goodness. If that's the accommodation we're going to get, well, of course we're going to come over to the UK for free. People pay thousands of pounds to go on holiday abroad to stay in similar accommodation. Harry Kemp, Z4S, says, "Hi, Sir Rees-Mogg. I know you've recently spoken about reforms planned for immigration control. What could you offer as a viable solution?" The thing about reforms plans, why I like it, is that it sets the conditions precedent for an effective migration policy. What do I mean by that? Well, you've got to leave the Refugee Convention and the Human Rights Convention and repeal the Human Rights Act. Until you do that, whatever laws you pass, they'll be overturned in the courts, either our courts or foreign courts. You've got to pull those out of all UK law and the direct applicability of the Human Rights Act, and then you can do it. As I've mentioned earlier in this podcast, the shocking view of the government that the rights of asylum seekers outrank those of local people just has to be reversed, and it needs to be reversed in law. If you do that, then the other parts of the scheme begin to work, the different types of housing, the deportation, and the returning of people to the countries they came from. What else have we got? I think that's the main immigration questions. There are one or two others. Oh, no, if an election were held tomorrow, this is from Alex Vernon, 7456. If an election was held tomorrow, what would be your biggest voting issue, illegal immigration or the economy? Honestly, I think they work hand in glove. I think immigration has had an economic effect. GDP per capita has not been growing, it's been shrinking, and the two will both benefit if immigration is controlled. That will give us an economic boost. It will help us boost productivity because mass migration has undercut the wages of the least well off in society. It's discouraged investment in business and the increase in productivity that you normally get. So productivity has been stagnant now for over 20 years as we've sucked on the teat of endless cheap labor. That needs to change. So migration and the economy go together. So there are some general questions which I couldn't categorize, which I thought it would be interesting to go through finally. So one of them is about, is Conservative Party opinion polling Kemi's fault, from AJ-E24ZP, another brilliant name. I wouldn't blame Kemi too much. We didn't govern well, and that's why we were defeated. And now we say things, but why should people believe us? We've got to rebuild trust. And I think Kemi is working hard to do that, and it takes time. Why am I like this -SI4PW? My thoughts on the struggle for UK university graduates to get an entry-level role. I'm afraid I think we have too many people going to university, and therefore they're being overpromised and then when they leave, the graduate jobs aren't there. But it's also to do with sluggish economic growth because of high taxation, failed government policy, lack of productivity, lack of competitiveness in the UK, all of which needs good Conservative government to do it. Julian de Croix says, where do you see the UK in 10 years' time? I think in 10 years' time, we will be much better off. I think we will get a right-wing government in 2028 or 29, and that will make the changes necessary. It will know what it needs to do. Captain Pom-Pom, any reaction to the engagement of Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce? I wish them well. I don't know a great deal about them, I will confess. But it's always good for people to get married, and so I would encourage them. And this ties in with Aoife Lau's recently married, and I'm curious what you feel the best thing is about having children. Well, they are an absolute joy and a delight. They are such fun. They're interesting from the moment they're born. They have their own characters, amazingly, the moment they appear. It's not just an extension of you and your spouse. They are their own individual characters, and they grow and they develop and they become the most wonderful companions. And I can hear one of them roaring about on his quad bike just outside this window. So if you heard a sudden roar, that was why. Children entertain you, they're fun, and their growth is a joy to behold. Jacob.ha says, what are your thoughts on J.D. Vance for president in 2028? Always a little bit reluctant to advise other countries on how they should vote. We don't much like it when people tell us what to do, but everything I've seen about him so far makes me think he's very impressive, and I love his support for freedom of speech, and I also admire the fact that he's made such success of himself from such a difficult start in life, and I'm delighted he's embraced the Catholic faith, which I would always encourage people to do. Joe W373 says, what does Focky knocking nihilabilification mean? It means the act or habit of estimating as worthless. So it's a great word which can be dropped into conversation at every opportunity. At CNNR says, can I do a Substack on Thomas Wentworth? Well, that leads me very nicely into the final question, because I am quite tempted to do that. But the final question that I'm going to read out comes from somebody who actually is another Thomas Wentworth. It's at Thomas Rees-Mogg. Why is your third child so much better than the rest of the troop? Well, all my troop are wonderful, but Thomas, thank you for looking at my online presence and looking at my social media and even asking me a question. That really is a notch on your belt and one-upmanship against the other five. Thank you not just to Thomas Wentworth, Somerset Dunstan, but to all my other communicants, and my apologies to those whose questions I couldn't answer. I couldn't keep you here all day, but please do subscribe, switch on notifications. Let me know in the text below the comments if you've enjoyed this or if it's really dull. If you want me to do it again, I will. If you want to have a snooze instead, let me know and I won't bother you. Thank you very much.